911 emergency. Please. Run on them, man.
Just after dawn, on the cold morning of December 26, 1996, Boulder, Colorado, lay under a heavy and untouched blanket of snow. The storm from the night before had left a perfect white covering over every rooftop, driveway, and branch, softening the sharp edges of the town into something almost dreamlike. The streets were still, as if frozen in time, and the air carried that distinct, almost magical stillness that comes only in the early hours after a snowfall. Not a single car moved, not a single door opened, and the only sound was the faint whisper of wind between the houses. It was the kind of morning that felt like a pause between breaths, the last traces of Christmas clinging to the world before normal life returned. Many homes still glowed with the warm light of stringed bulbs and candles left burning overnight. Wreaths hung neatly on doors, untouched by the bustle of visitors. Frost crept across window panes, distorting the holiday decorations behind them into abstract, shimmering colors. The entire scene could have been captured on a postcard. But the beauty of that winter morning was deceptive. Beneath the soft white stillness, something dark had taken root. On 15th Street, the Ramsay residence stood out even among Boulder's more affluent homes. A grand Tudor-style mansion with steep gables, carefully maintained brickwork, and ornate wooden trim, it looked every bit the home of a well-to-do family. Its wide front steps had been swept clear the previous day, and garlands wrapped around the porch railings still held their shape despite the cold. Through the large bay windows, one could imagine the remnants of the previous day's Christmas celebrations. Discarded wrapping paper, half-finished cups of cocoa, and toys scattered on the floor. The Ramsays were well known in Boulder society. John Ramsay was a successful businessman, the president of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had recently become a billion-dollar enterprise. Patsy Ramsay, his wife, was a former beauty queen, Miss West Virginia of 1977, who took great pride in her family's image and their home. Together they had 2 children, Burke, 9 years old, and JonBenét, just 6. JonBenét was a strikingly beautiful child, with golden hair, bright eyes, and a smile that seemed made for the stage. She was already well known in child beauty pageant circles, winning titles, sashes, and trophies with an ease that made her a standout in every competition. To neighbors and friends, the Ramsays seemed to have it all: wealth, beauty, and a picture-perfect family life. But as dawn broke that December morning, the illusion would shatter in a way no one could have foreseen. At exactly 5:52 a.m., the Boulder Police Department received a call from the Ramsay home. Patsy Ramsay's voice trembled with urgency and confusion as she reported something no parent should ever have to say: her daughter was missing. The words spilled out in gasps, her tone swinging between panic and disbelief. She told the dispatcher that she had found a ransom note, a note that claimed JonBenét had been taken from her bed sometime during the night. The details she gave were strange from the beginning. The note, according to Patsy, demanded a very specific ransom, $118,000, to be paid in cash. It wasn't a round number. It wasn't the kind of sum a random kidnapper might choose. Later, investigators would note that this amount was almost exactly the value of John Ramsay's most recent work bonus. But in those early minutes, before the investigators arrived, all that mattered was the fear. Patsy's voice cracked as she pleaded for police to come immediately. She said the note instructed them not to call authorities, but she had done so anyway. A choice that, for reasons still debated decades later, would become one of many points of contention in the case. As officers began to make their way through the icy streets towards 755 15th Street, the scene inside the house remained tense and chaotic. Patsy, still in the clothes she had worn to bed, a velvet top and matching pants, told officers she had awoken early to prepare for a planned family trip to Michigan. She said she had gone down the spiral staircase to the kitchen, only to spot the ransom note laid out across the wooden steps. The note itself was unusually long for a ransom demand, spanning 3 pages. It began with the words, "Mr. Ramsay, listen carefully," and was written in a tone that seemed part threatening, part strangely theatrical. The author claimed to be a member of a small foreign faction, and threatened to kill JonBenét if the instructions were not followed exactly. They demanded that John collect the money, with specific instructions for how and when they would contact him to arrange the delivery. The longer officers spent inside the home, the stranger the situation appeared. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no splintered door frames, no footprints in the fresh snow outside. This was a kidnapping that, at first glance, left no trace of the kidnapper. John Ramsay, described later as calm but focused, began making phone calls almost immediately, not just to police, but to friends and family. Within hours, people began arriving at the house to comfort the family, but also to assist in the search. This steady stream of visitors, well-meaning as they may have been, would later be seen as a critical error. The house quickly became crowded, and the crime scene, already fragile, grew more contaminated with each new arrival. Officers searched the home room by room, looking for any clue, anything at all that might indicate where JonBenét had been taken. But as the hours passed, no call from the so-called kidnappers came. The ransom note had specified that John would be contacted between 8 o'clock and 10 a.m. That window came and went in silence. At one point, Detective Linda Arndt, the sole Boulder officer left to manage the scene after other personnel were called away, suggested that John Ramsay search the house from top to bottom. By midday, John, accompanied by his friend Fleet White, began methodically checking rooms. Eventually, John descended into the basement, a dimly lit, cluttered area that had not yet been fully examined. There, in a small, windowless storage room, John found his daughter. She was lying on the floor, covered partially by a white blanket. A piece of cord was wrapped around her wrists, and duct tape covered her mouth. John scooped her up and carried her upstairs, placing her in the living room. What happened in that moment is something investigators would later debate endlessly. By moving the body, the scene was irreversibly altered. Any fibers, hairs, or other trace evidence on the blanket or the floor were potentially lost. Yet to John, in that moment, she was not evidence. She was his little girl. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. JonBenét was pronounced dead at the scene. The holiday, the family trip, the life they had known, all of it ended in that instant. Outside, the snow still lay untouched, the neighborhood still quiet. But inside the Ramsay home, nothing would ever be the same. The story that began on that still December morning would spread far beyond Boulder, dominating headlines across the country and sparking decades of speculation, investigation, and controversy. The perfect holiday postcard scene had given way to one of the most haunting and puzzling crimes in American history, a case that, nearly 3 decades later, remains unsolved. A woman's voice, calm, measured, almost eerily composed, cut through the pre-dawn stillness. There was no hysteria, no screaming, no incoherent panic that one might expect from a mother claiming her child had been taken in the dead of night. Instead, the tone was steady, deliberate, as if each word had been carefully chosen before it was spoken. "We have a kidnapping," she told the 911 operator. "Not my daughter has been taken. Not someone's broken into our home. Just a flat, clinical declaration, we have a kidnapping." Before she even mentioned her daughter's name, she brought up the ransom note. That, to her, seemed the most pressing detail, the piece of paper now sitting at the center of the unfolding nightmare. It was no hastily scribbled demand. It was a 3-page letter, written in a hand that appeared deliberate but not rushed, sprawled across lined pages torn from a legal pad. Not just any pad, but one taken from inside her own home, her own stationery. Whoever wrote it had been in the house long enough to find it, sit down, and write a message of almost cinematic drama. The content of that note was just as strange. It demanded exactly $118,000. Not a round number, not an arbitrary sum. It was the exact amount of John Ramsay's most recent Christmas bonus from his company. The coincidence was almost impossible to ignore. This was either the work of someone who knew the Ramsays personally, or someone with access to deeply private financial information. The author of the note claimed to be part of a small foreign faction, a vague, almost absurd-sounding description that raised more questions than it answered. They threatened to kill JonBenét if the instructions were not followed to the letter. The primary instruction, "Do not call the police," Failure to comply, the note said, would mean the child's immediate execution. And yet, despite that dire warning, Patsy Ramsey called the police almost immediately after reading it. There was no hesitation, no waiting for the kidnapper's promised call, a call that, by the note's instructions, was supposed to come between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock that morning. It never came. The kidnappers, whoever they were, never called back at all. No follow-up, no confirmation of life, no attempt to arrange the exchange of money for the safe return of the little girl. And that, perhaps more than any other detail, was the first crack in the story. Because if this truly had been a kidnapping, if the abductors had gone to such extraordinary lengths to write a ransom note and specify such an oddly precise amount of money, why wouldn't they call to collect? Why would they risk leaving a child in the house, write a note inside that very home, and then vanish without another word? It was a question that would haunt the case for decades. Hours later, as the pale winter light shifted toward midday, the atmosphere inside the Ramsey home grew heavier with every passing minute. The initial flurry of police activity had given way to an uneasy stillness. Friends and neighbors had gathered in the living room, murmuring in hushed voices, offering coffee, blankets, and whispered reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. The ransom note's deadline had come and gone without a single phone call. Each tick of the clock seemed to stretch longer than the last. The air was thick, not just with tension, but with something else. Confusion, unease, an unspoken awareness that whatever had happened to JonBenét, the answers might not be found outside the house at all. Detective Linda Arndt, still the sole officer left inside after others had been dispatched elsewhere, watched John Ramsey closely. He appeared restless, pacing, making phone calls, moving between rooms. At one point, she suggested he search the home again, top to bottom, to see if anything had been overlooked. It was a simple instruction, but one that would lead to the most chilling discovery of the day. John Ramsey nodded, and with family friend Fleet White accompanying him, began checking the lower levels of the house. The two men moved methodically, from room to room, until they reached the basement. The air there was colder, the lighting dim, shadows pooling in the corners. The hum of the furnace was the only sound. They passed through the storage area, the laundry space, and then reached a small, rarely used room at the far end, the wine cellar. It was more than just a place for bottles. It was a cramped, windowless space with a single bare light bulb casting a yellowish glow. John reached for the door, which was closed but not locked, and swung it open. What he saw stopped him cold. Lying on the floor, motionless, was his 6-year-old daughter. She was covered partially with a white blanket, her blonde hair spilling across the fabric like a halo. A cord was looped around her wrists. A strip of duct tape sealed her mouth. In that instant, the search for a missing child became something much darker. On the cold, unyielding concrete floor of the basement, the air hung heavy with dampness and the faint, musty scent of a room seldom entered. Shadows clung to the corners, and the dim glow from a single bare bulb overhead cast a sickly yellow light across the scene. Beneath a white blanket, small enough to cover the fragile form beneath it, lay the body of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. The fabric was pulled back, and the heartbreaking sight beneath was unlike anything a parent should ever have to witness. JonBenét's skin, once warm with life, was pale and cold. Her bright, pageant-ready smile, the one that had so often lit up a stage and charmed crowds, was gone. Instead, her face was eerily still, her eyes closed as though frozen in a sleep from which she would never wake. Across her mouth, pressed firmly against the delicate skin, was a strip of silver duct tape. It sealed her lips shut in a way that seemed almost symbolic of the silence that would now forever surround her voice. Her wrists were bound tightly in front of her with thin, braided nylon cord, the kind that could be purchased in any hardware store, digging into the flesh and leaving marks that hinted at her final moments. But perhaps most chilling was what encircled her neck. A length of the same nylon cord was tied into a crude garrote, the handle fashioned from the broken shaft of a paintbrush. This was no simple knot, no improvised restraint. It was deliberate, constructed with the kind of grim precision that spoke of intent. The cord cut into the tender skin of her throat, leaving behind the unmistakable evidence of its deadly purpose. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. The air in the cramped space felt heavier, harder to breathe. John Ramsay froze, his mind struggling to process what lay before him. The small, windowless wine cellar, a space usually reserved for storing bottles, holiday decorations, and miscellaneous household items, had become the final resting place for his youngest child. He dropped to his knees beside her. His hands, trembling, reached out instinctively, brushing the hair from her face, touching her cheek as if some lingering warmth might still be found. It was a father's reflex, to hold, to protect, to rescue, even when the rescue had already come too late. In that moment, the procedural demands of a crime scene meant nothing to him. For John Ramsay, there was no thought of preserving fibers, fingerprints, or DNA. There was only the overwhelming need to take his daughter into his arms. And so, with the broken paintbrush handle still looped around her neck, he lifted her gently but urgently from the cold floor. The white blanket slipped around her as he rose, and he carried her up the narrow stairs, away from the shadows and into the light of the main floor. It was an act of pure grief and paternal instinct, but it was also, in the eyes of investigators, a catastrophic mistake. Every inch of her blanket, every strand of her hair, every fold of her clothing held the potential for microscopic evidence. Evidence that might have pointed to her killer. The basement floor, the position of her body, the fibers clinging to her clothing, all of it was now compromised. The moment John emerged from the basement, the quiet in the house shattered. Gasps and cries broke out from those gathered. Friends and neighbors, who had come earlier to provide comfort, now found themselves in the presence of something unspeakable. Detective Linda Arndt, who had been the only officer remaining inside the house for most of the morning, watched as John placed JonBenét's body gently on the floor near the Christmas tree. The image was surreal, the glittering ornaments, the wrapped presents, and the lifeless child lying among them, still partially wrapped in her white blanket. Some of those present knelt beside her, touching her, adjusting the blanket. Others wept openly. The house, which had been bustling with a restless kind of hope just hours before, now felt claustrophobic, the air thick with disbelief. This was no longer the scene of a kidnapping. It was the scene of a homicide. Paramedics were called, but it was only a formality. JonBenét was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner would later determine that she had died from asphyxiation associated with strangulation, and that she also had a skull fracture. The combination of injuries left a grim puzzle. Which had come first, and why had both been inflicted? From an investigative standpoint, the discovery in the basement raised more questions than it answered. The ransom note had insisted that JonBenét had been taken from the house. If that were true, why was she found mere steps away from where her family had slept? The note's author had threatened that the child would be killed if the police were called, yet the police had been contacted almost immediately, and she had already been dead for hours. The demand for $118,000 seemed strangely specific, almost intimate in its knowledge of John's recent bonus, and yet the kidnappers never made a single call to arrange the exchange. Then there was the matter of the garrote. It wasn't something typically associated with crimes of passion or impulsive violence. Its construction suggested time, privacy, and intent. And the broken paintbrush handle had once belonged to Patsy Ramsay. The rest of the brush was later found among her art supplies in the basement. Even the location of the body, that small, cluttered wine cellar, was telling. It wasn't an obvious hiding place to a stranger. It was behind a door that, while not locked, was tucked away in a part of the basement rarely visited by outsiders. To find it, one would need either prior familiarity with the layout of the house or the willingness to explore it in detail without fear of being discovered. By the time crime scene technicians began their work, the damage to the evidence was severe. Friends, neighbors, and even some responding officers had moved freely through the house all morning, touching surfaces, walking through rooms, and potentially tracking material from one place to another. The ransom note had been handled by multiple people. And JonBenét's body, which should have been left untouched until documented, had been carried through the house and laid in an area where others knelt beside her. For the Boulder Police Department, the case was already complicated. Now, with the contamination of the scene, it would become one of the most challenging and controversial investigations in American history. In the weeks that followed, public attention shifted from the image of a kidnapped child to the growing suspicion that the answers to JonBenét's murder might lie within the walls of her own home. The timeline, the ransom note, the location of the body, and the absence of any credible evidence of an intruder all became points of intense scrutiny. But in that moment, on that December morning, none of those questions could eclipse the raw reality of what had just occurred. The Christmas tree still glowed in the corner. Snow still fell outside, blanketing the streets in silence. And on the living room floor, surrounded by the people who had loved her most, lay the body of a little girl whose life had been cut short in a way so brutal, so baffling, that it would haunt her family and the world for decades to come. By midday, thin strips of yellow crime scene tape snapped and fluttered in the sharp winter wind, a hollow attempt to cordon off what had already been irreparably compromised. The Ramsay home, which only hours earlier had been a warm, glittering image of holiday comfort, now stood as the center of a homicide investigation, but the most critical window for preserving its secrets had already closed. From the moment Patsy Ramsey's 911 call had gone out that morning, people had been coming and going with little restriction. Friends arrived to offer comfort, neighbors stopped by to lend support, and family members moved about the rooms in a fog of disbelief. Even police officers, responding without yet fully grasping the gravity of what had happened, walked the halls without enforcing strict boundaries. There had been no immediate lockdown of the property, no ordered removal of non-essential people, and no clear protocol to secure the scene. They wandered through the kitchen, the living room, the hallways. Some sat at the table, sipping coffee from the Ramsay's cups. Others leaned against counters, touched doorknobs, moved objects out of the way. Furniture was shifted, doors were opened and closed, and surfaces were brushed by countless hands. Footsteps tracked from carpet to tile to hardwood, leaving invisible trails of cross-contamination. The ransom note, potentially one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case, had been picked up, read, and handled by more than one person before investigators could photograph it in place. Objects near where JonBenét's body had been found upstairs were moved or adjusted as people tried to make her more comfortable, unintentionally smudging away fingerprints or disturbing fibers. By the time the house was officially treated as a crime scene, the lines between original evidence and contamination had blurred beyond repair. What might have been vital clues, a hair left behind, a footprint in carpet pile, a microscopic skin cell on a blanket, could now belong to any of the dozens who had touched, walked through, or lingered in the house since dawn. In the cold light of that December afternoon, the reality was inescapable. The crime scene had not been protected. It had been trampled, touched, and altered in ways that would haunt the investigation for years to come. What had begun as a possible kidnapping had transformed into a homicide with a crime scene so compromised that, in many ways, it would never fully recover. Mud marked the carpets. Not just a few errant smudges from a single hurried step, but a trail. Damp, dirty imprints that spoke of hurried movement, of boots or shoes that had crossed the snowy lawn, climbed the front steps, and crossed the Ramsay threshold without a moment's hesitation. Each step embedded into the cream-colored fibers like a silent act of sabotage against the very investigation that had barely begun. The once pristine hallway now bore a grim new pattern. Stains in irregular shapes, fading in some spots, sharper in others, each one telling its own microscopic story of who had been there, when, and in what condition. The police would later insist that they had done the best they could given the chaos, the size of the home, and the emotional volatility of those inside. But the truth was undeniable. The Ramsay residence, from the moment officers arrived, was never truly secured. Fingerprint dust would never touch certain areas that day because fingerprints, fresh, potentially incriminating, had already been obscured by touch after touch. Fingerprints smudged the banister where the ransom note had been. The smooth would surface no longer a clean archive of whoever had leaned there, steadied themselves, or absent-mindedly gripped it while their mind processed the horror. Instead, it was a palimpsest of overlapping oils and moisture, where the original impressions were distorted, blurred into nothing useful. Detectives couldn't determine which belonged to residents, which belonged to friends, and which might have belonged to someone who had no business being there at all. It wasn't just the banister. Cabinet handles in the kitchen had been touched by officers, friends, even neighbors who had been called over to support the family. Mugs and glasses from which coffee had been sipped sat rinsed in the sink, their once pristine surfaces washed clean before crime scene photographers could even capture them. Doors had been opened and closed without gloves. The basement light switches, potential touch points for an intruder, bore fingerprints smeared into uselessness. The contamination was not subtle. It was pervasive. It spread like a quiet, invisible tide from the front entryway to the bedrooms upstairs, into the kitchen, and finally down the narrow stairs toward the basement. This contamination would haunt the case for decades, not because the presence of outside DNA or fingerprints was unusual in a lived-in home, but because no one could ever again say, with complete certainty, what belonged to the killer and what belonged to the dozens of people who had tramped through the Ramsay residence on December 26, 1996. Every time a potential piece of physical evidence surfaced in later months, a stray fiber on JonBenét's blanket, an unidentified hair in the wine cellar, a partial palm print on the back door, defense attorneys and armchair analysts alike could point to that chaotic first day and shrug. It could have been anyone. The moment that front door failed to become a hard barrier between the crime scene and the outside world, the entire foundation of the investigation began to crack. It wasn't just a procedural misstep. It was an irreversible loss, a void into which crucial facts likely fell, never to be recovered. And it was preventable. That, perhaps, was the bitterest truth of all. Crime scene preservation is not a luxury in homicide investigations. It is the very spine of the process. The Ramsay home was large, yes, but not unmanageable. There were enough officers present to have established a clear perimeter, assigned entry and exit points, and documented every single person stepping across the threshold. There were enough opportunities to have limited contact with objects and surfaces until forensic specialists arrived. But the urgency to comfort, to do something, collided with the discipline of methodical police work, and the comfort won. By the time the coroner arrived, the home was less a crime scene than a gathering place, part family refuge, part neighborhood wake, part police staging area. The sound of footsteps echoed against hardwood floors not because they belonged to a fleeing suspect, but because a friend had gone to fetch another blanket for Patsy, or because an officer had wandered upstairs to check on John. The murmured voices in the hall were not interrogations but reassurances. Small, seemingly harmless acts became acts of destruction when viewed through the lens of forensic integrity. An officer placing a comforting hand on a chair back left behind a fingerprint that could later mask the print of an intruder. A neighbor setting her mug on the counter might have deposited a fragment of fiber from her own clothing, potentially confounding later trace analysis. Even the warmth of bodies in certain rooms could accelerate the degradation of biological evidence left behind hours earlier. Years later, when experts attempted to reconstruct the events of that day, they found themselves fighting against an impenetrable fog. The early photographs, some of which were taken after items had already been moved, became suspect. Testimonies about the exact position of objects were riddled with contradictions, because multiple people remembered seeing them in multiple places. Forensic science thrives on clarity. It demands a scene frozen in time, a setting that mirrors the moment of the crime with as little alteration as possible. But the Ramsay case had no such freeze frame. It was like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle where someone had already swapped out a third of the pieces with ones from an entirely different box. This contamination became the silent defense for every suspect ever considered. It was a shield behind which both family members and unknown intruders could theoretically hide. No matter what the evidence suggested, the counterargument was always ready. Can you prove it wasn't contaminated? The damage went beyond the courtroom and into the public arena. When media coverage intensified and theories began to multiply, one of the most consistent refrains from skeptics was that the crime scene was so badly mishandled, no definitive answers could ever be drawn from it. Documentaries would replay grainy footage of people walking in and out of the Ramsay home that morning, each step a visual metaphor for lost opportunity. In this way, the contamination became almost mythic, not just a procedural error, but a character in the story itself. It was the phantom suspect, the invisible accomplice to whoever had murdered JonBenét Ramsey. And like all enduring myths, it carried with it a lesson, one that has been written into police training manuals and hammered into the minds of rookie officers ever since. You get one chance to preserve a crime scene. One chance. Once the purity of that moment is gone, it cannot be restored, no matter how skilled the investigators, no matter how advanced the forensic technology becomes in the decades that follow. In Boulder, Colorado, on that cold December day, that one chance slipped away almost as quickly as it began. And with it, so too may have slipped the best, perhaps the only opportunity to uncover the unaltered truth about what happened to JonBenét Ramsey in the dark hours between Christmas night and the breaking dawn. JonBenét Ramsey was, by all outward appearances, a man whose life told the perfect success story. A decorated former naval officer, he had parlayed his discipline, leadership, and technical expertise into a thriving career in the corporate world. In 1996, he was the president of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise under his leadership. His colleagues described him as confident but reserved, a man who carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who had worked for everything he had. At 53, he was well respected in Boulder's business and social circles, known for his sharp mind, methodical problem-solving skills, and his ability to remain composed under pressure. Patsy Ramsey, by contrast, was the vibrant social centerpiece of the family. Born Patricia and Paul in Parkersburg, West Virginia, she had risen to local fame when she won the coveted title of Miss West Virginia in 1977. That pageant experience, filled with dazzling gowns, public appearances, and an almost obsessive attention to detail, would later become a central part of her identity. After marrying John in 1980, she embraced her role as a wife, mother, and enthusiastic participant in Boulder's charity events. Those who knew her described her as warm, friendly, and intensely proud of her children. Her love for pageantry naturally extended to her daughter, JonBenét, who, at just 6 years old, was already a regular on the child beauty pageant circuit. From the outside, the Ramseys' life seemed like a glossy magazine spread, an elegant home in an affluent neighborhood, 2 beautiful children, and social connections that ran deep. They attended church regularly, hosted holiday gatherings, and contributed generously to local causes. To friends, they were a couple who seemed to have it all. But in the days following December 26, 1996, the golden image began to fracture. The death of JonBenét was not just a tragedy, it was a public spectacle. And almost immediately, the intense media coverage turned the Ramseys from grieving parents into potential suspects in the eyes of both the public and law enforcement. Investigators began digging into every facet of their lives. Interviews with friends and acquaintances revealed cracks in the picture-perfect narrative. Some described Patsy as driven, almost to the point of being controlling, when it came to JonBenét's pageants. Every costume, every hairstyle, every routine was meticulously planned, as if perfection was the only acceptable outcome. Others suggested that the demands of John's work and travel sometimes left him emotionally distant from the family, relying on Patsy to manage the household. But more than their personalities, it was their behavior in the immediate aftermath of JonBenét's death that began to raise eyebrows. From the moment the ransom note was discovered, inconsistencies emerged. The note itself was handwritten on paper from inside the Ramsey home, something investigators found deeply suspicious. And while it warned against contacting the police, Patsy had called 911 almost immediately. Then there was the issue of John's discovery of JonBenét's body. Instead of leaving the scene untouched for forensic processing, he had carried her upstairs, cradling her in his arms, an act that, while understandable for a grieving father, effectively compromised a crucial crime scene. The garrote, the duct tape, the bindings, all could have yielded valuable evidence that was now lost or contaminated. The contamination didn't stop there. By the time the police officially secured the Ramsey residence, friends, neighbors, and even a victim's advocate from the police department had walked through multiple rooms, touched doorknobs, sat on chairs, and used the kitchen. A pot of coffee had been brewed, cups rinsed in the sink. Mud tracked in from boots left marks on the carpeting. Fingerprints, innocent or not, were now smeared across surfaces, blending with those that might have belonged to an intruder. The result was a nightmare for forensic investigators. Each compromised piece of evidence gave defense attorneys more ammunition to question the reliability of the prosecution's case. Every footprint, every fiber, every smudge could now be argued as the result of contamination rather than a clear connection to the perpetrator. In the media, the narrative began to shift. The Ramseys were no longer just victims. They were the center of a true crime drama playing out in real time. Headlines speculated about family dynamics, hidden tensions, and whether the glamorous pageant world had somehow contributed to JonBenét's death. Talk show hosts dissected the ransom note word by word. True crime pundits debated whether the evidence pointed to an intruder or someone inside the house. The pressure on the Ramseys was immense. Patsy, often dressed in her trademark bold colors and pearl necklaces, appeared at press conferences with John by her side, both of them pleading for the public's help in finding JonBenét's killer. But to some observers, their demeanor seemed odd, too controlled, too rehearsed. Others believed it was simply the only way they could survive the crushing grief while under the glare of cameras. In the months and years that followed, suspicion would ebb and flow between the intruder theory and the possibility of family involvement. The Ramseys themselves hired high-powered attorneys and public relations specialists, determined to clear their names. They also underwent extensive interviews with investigators and even sat for televised specials defending their innocence. But no matter how many times they proclaimed it, the shadow of suspicion lingered. The once admired couple, who had embodied the American dream, now found themselves in a limbo between public sympathy and public doubt. The dream house at 755 15th Street, once filled with holiday laughter and children's voices, had become a symbol of unanswered questions, a place where a nation's fascination with crime, tragedy, and scandal would remain frozen in time. And for John and Patsy Ramsey, life would never return to what it had been before that snowy December morning. The perfect image was gone, replaced by a legacy they could neither escape nor fully explain, forever bound to the mystery of JonBenét's death. Investigators quickly realized that the ransom note wasn't just unusual, it was downright bizarre for a supposed kidnapping. Most ransom notes are short, direct, and to the point. They rarely exceed a few sentences, and they certainly don't span multiple pages. Yet here was a meticulously handwritten letter that took up 2.5 pages, totaling 370 words, longer than many police reports. It was written on the Ramsey family's own stationery, using a pen from their home, which immediately raised questions. Why would an intruder waste precious minutes, possibly even an hour or more, inside the victim's home crafting such a lengthy document, instead of bringing one pre-prepared? The content of the note was equally suspicious. It demanded exactly $118,000, the precise amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from his company that year. This was not a round figure like $100,000 or $150,000, which a stranger might choose at random. It was oddly specific, suggesting the author had intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family's finances. Investigators began to wonder, was this figure chosen because the writer was someone inside the home, or at least close enough to the family to know such private details? Even more troubling were the stylistic quirks in the note. FBI profilers pointed out that much of the language was oddly maternal in tone. Certain phrases, while meant to sound threatening, carried an almost protective undercurrent, as if the writer was attempting to soften the cruelty with a strange sort of familiarity. The letter also contained multiple references that seemed to mirror lines from Hollywood films, particularly thrillers from the late 1980s and early 1990s. To seasoned investigators, this mix of personal financial knowledge, cinematic flair, and maternal undertones didn't point to a professional kidnapper. It pointed to someone with an emotional connection to the household. Then there was the issue of handwriting. Forensic document examiners compared the letter against samples from both John and Patsy Ramsey. While John was quickly ruled out, Patsy's results were far murkier. Several experts testified that they could not exclude her as the author. Certain letter formations, slants, and word spacing patterns bore striking similarities to her known writing style. However, in the world of forensic handwriting analysis, cannot exclude is not the same as confirmed match. This gray area left investigators stuck in a frustrating limbo. They couldn't prove Patsy wrote it, but they also couldn't clear her. To make matters worse, the content of the note conflicted with the family's actions on the morning of December 26th. The kidnappers had explicitly warned, "Do not contact police or authorities or your daughter dies." Yet, less than an hour after supposedly discovering the note, Patsy called 911. She did so in a manner that struck many as strange, not frantically screaming about her missing child, but speaking in a calm, formal tone. Operators later recalled that she never once referred to JonBenét as "my daughter." Instead, she referred to a kidnapping and a ransom note. That absence of personal language, especially from a mother whose 6-year-old had supposedly been taken, lingered in investigators' minds like a shadow over the rest of the case. In the days that followed, the ransom note became a central focus of the investigation. Every word, every comma, every indentation was scrutinized. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts, who concluded the writer was likely someone educated, practiced in writing, and possibly female. Linguists noted that certain word choices reflected middle to upper class vernacular, suggesting the author was not some random drifter or desperate criminal, but rather someone embedded in a comfortable lifestyle. This profile aligned disturbingly well with Patsy Ramsey's background. Adding to the suspicion was the timeline of the morning itself. For the ransom note to be written on Ramsey family stationery inside the house, the perpetrator would have needed to spend a significant amount of time inside, undetected, after supposedly kidnapping JonBenét. They would have needed to locate the stationery, find a writing instrument, sit down, and compose a 370-word letter without being heard or interrupted. In a large home filled with family members, that scenario seemed improbable, unless, of course, the writer already belonged there. The unusual ransom amount, the handwriting similarities, the strange choice of words, and the immediate disregard for the kidnapper's warning to avoid police all combined into a deeply unsettling picture. For investigators, the ransom note was no longer simply a piece of evidence. It was a psychological roadmap. It offered clues about the author's mindset, education level, and relationship to the victim. And in almost every category, those clues seemed to circle back toward the Ramsey household itself. Yet despite the mountain of suspicion, the case remained maddeningly circumstantial. There was no video footage of anyone writing the note, no fingerprints on the paper, no smoking gun that could definitively tie Patsy to the pen. In court, defense attorneys could, and did, argue that the handwriting similarities were coincidental, the tone merely a reflection of someone trying to mimic a criminal style, and the ransom amount an unlucky coincidence. Without conclusive proof, the note became a weapon wielded by both sides. To the prosecution, it screamed inside job, but to the defense, it was an elaborate red herring planted to frame the Ramseys. This document, perhaps more than any other piece of evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case, encapsulated the frustrating nature of the investigation. It was a puzzle within a puzzle, a clue that pointed in all directions at once. And for every investigator who saw it as Patsy's work, there was another who believed it could have been crafted by a cunning outsider, someone who wanted the finger pointed squarely at the family from the start. The revelation in 2016 was a gut punch to those who had clung to the mystery intruder explanation for 2 decades. The original 2008 finding, a single, unknown male DNA profile, had been the lifeline for the Ramsey family's innocence in the public eye. It was the evidence that seemed to vindicate them, to lift the shadow of suspicion that had lingered for years. The Boulder District Attorney's Office even issued a formal apology to John and Patsy Ramsey, publicly declaring they were no longer considered suspects. But forensic science doesn't stand still. By 2016, next-generation sequencing techniques allowed experts to detect much smaller, degraded DNA fragments and separate overlapping genetic material with greater precision. When these more sensitive tests were applied to JonBenét's long-preserved clothing samples, the results were not as clear-cut as once believed. Instead of one consistent male profile, analysts found multiple male DNA contributors. None of them matched John, Burke, or any known suspect. That alone might sound promising for an intruder theory. After all, multiple unknown profiles could mean multiple people involved. But the opposite was also true. It could mean the DNA was a result of contamination, either during manufacturing of the clothing or during the chaotic crime scene handling. And contamination was everywhere in this case. From the moment police arrived on December 26, 1996, the scene had been anything but secure. Friends and family wandered through the Ramsay home. Officers drank coffee in the kitchen. Items were moved, touched, handled. JonBenét's body was carried upstairs without proper evidence precautions. Every action blurred the line between real forensic evidence and noise. This is where the 2016 results became even more complicated. Multiple contributors meant you could no longer point to a single foreign male as the smoking gun. The DNA could have come from a factory worker who handled JonBenét's underwear before it was sold. It could have come from someone at the Christmas party days earlier. It could have even been transferred by one of the many people inside the house after her death. For seasoned investigators, this was a nightmare scenario, because it meant that the strongest piece of physical evidence pointing away from the family might not be meaningful at all. The lone intruder theory, once bolstered by the idea of a single, clear foreign DNA profile, suddenly looked fragile. It left open the possibility, one many in law enforcement had privately believed from the beginning, that the killer could have been inside the house that night. It's worth remembering that by this point, the case had already been warped by years of public speculation, tabloid headlines, and a media frenzy unlike anything the Boulder Police Department had ever seen. Every twist in the DNA story was amplified, misinterpreted, or oversimplified for public consumption. In 2008, the headline was DNA Clears the Ramsays. By 2016, it was DNA Evidence Under Question. And for the Ramsay family, it meant their nightmare, both personal and public, was never truly over. In fact, the updated DNA findings deepened the central divide in the case. The intruder camp argued the presence of any unknown DNA, no matter how small or mixed, meant someone outside the family was involved. They pointed to the open basement window, the strange ransom note, and the garrote as signs of a planned abduction gone wrong. The inside job camp countered that multiple DNA contributors, all tiny, degraded, and inconclusive, were exactly what you'd expect from contamination. They pointed to behavioral evidence, inconsistencies in the Ramsay interviews, and the improbability of an intruder navigating the house undetected. In other words, the science that was supposed to clarify things only made the mystery harder to untangle. And while the public debated, the case files gathered dust. Detectives retired. Patsy Ramsay passed away in 2006, never seeing her daughter's killer brought to justice. John Ramsay moved out of Colorado, remarried, and largely stepped out of the spotlight, though he continues to call for renewed investigation to this day. The DNA revelation in 2016 was supposed to be a turning point. Instead, it became just another entry in the long, tangled history of the JonBenét Ramsey case. A story where every answer only seems to raise more questions, and where, nearly 3 decades later, the truth still slips just out of reach. Suspicion turned to 9-year-old Burke Ramsay. Investigators knew that in many family-related homicides involving children, siblings could sometimes play an unintentional role, particularly if tempers flared or accidents occurred during moments of play or conflict. Burke had been in the house the night JonBenét died. He had not been woken up until much later, according to the parents, but the forensic evidence suggested he may have been awake and active during a critical time window. A bowl of pineapple with his fingerprints was found in the kitchen. The bowl contained pieces of fresh pineapple and milk, something that friends of the family said was not a typical late-night snack for JonBenét but something Burke was known to eat. The fingerprints matched Burke's, though the bowl was also handled by others, making it difficult to determine exactly when the prints were left. The location of the bowl, on a countertop rather than in the sink, raised the possibility that it had been set out recently, close to the time of the murder. Partially digested pineapple was in JonBenét's stomach. This was a critical clue. Forensic pathology determined that the pineapple had been consumed roughly 1 to 2 hours before her death. That meant she had eaten after arriving home from the Christmas party that night. The Ramsays claimed that JonBenét was asleep when they carried her inside and that she was put directly to bed. If this was true, she could not have eaten the pineapple unless she awoke later. The inconsistency between the family's account and the medical evidence became a central point of suspicion. The juxtaposition of these facts led to a question investigators could not ignore. Was there a sibling altercation? In some versions of this theory, JonBenét may have been awake in the kitchen late at night, possibly sharing a snack with Burke. A dispute could have broken out, over the pineapple, over a toy, or over some unrelated matter, leading to an impulsive physical act. In children, even a relatively minor blow can have catastrophic consequences. The head injury found on JonBenét was severe enough to render her unconscious instantly. If Burke had struck her with an object, such as the flashlight found on the kitchen counter, it might explain the absence of defensive wounds and the massive cranial trauma. An accident covered up? This was the theory that some investigators and consultants began to favor. They speculated that the parents, upon finding their daughter gravely injured or dead, might have panicked. In this scenario, the garrote, the elaborate ransom note, and the staging in the basement could have been an attempt to redirect suspicion toward an intruder. The motive for such a cover-up would be to protect Burke from legal consequences, media scrutiny, and lifelong stigma. Given the family's wealth, social standing, and access to legal counsel, some believed they would have had both the motive and the means to orchestrate a misleading crime scene. Theories swirled beyond the Ramsay household. Some accused the parents of staging the scene outright, without any involvement from Burke. They pointed to the ransom note, written on paper from inside the home, in handwriting that some experts could not exclude as Patsy Ramsay's, as evidence of deliberate manipulation. They argued that the improbably long, theatrical nature of the note, combined with the fact that it demanded a very specific ransom amount that matched John Ramsay's recent work bonus, suggested inside knowledge. The scene in the basement, with JonBenét's body covered by a blanket, a garrote fashioned from one of Patsy's paintbrushes, and no signs of forced entry, was, in their view, more consistent with staging than with the actions of a hurried intruder. Others pointed to outside suspects. One such individual was Gary Oliva, a known sex offender with a history of inappropriate fixation on young girls. Oliva was reportedly in Boulder at the time of the murder and was later found with a photograph of JonBenét in his possession. He also allegedly made statements to acquaintances suggesting that her death had been accidental but that he had loved her. Although he was questioned and even arrested years later on unrelated charges, DNA testing did not conclusively link him to the crime scene. Still, his disturbing history and erratic behavior kept him on the radar of armchair detectives and some investigators. Another figure was Michael Helgoth, a man with a troubled background who worked in a salvage yard near Boulder. Helgoth had reportedly spoken to a coworker about a potential big score around the time of the murder, a score that would yield a large financial payout. This was particularly noteworthy given that the ransom note demanded $118,000, an oddly specific figure that matched John Ramsay's Christmas bonus that year. Helgoth's death, which was officially ruled a suicide, occurred shortly after a press conference in which the Boulder County District Attorney suggested that new leads were about to break the case. Some saw the timing as suspicious, suggesting that guilt or fear of exposure may have driven him to take his own life. These outside suspect theories had their challenges. In Oliva's case, his DNA did not match the male DNA profile found on JonBenét's clothing, and he could not be placed definitively inside the Ramsay home. In Helgoth's case, no physical evidence linked him to the crime scene, and the big score comment remained hearsay. Still, the possibility of an intruder was not entirely dismissed, particularly given the presence of an open basement window and a suitcase beneath it, which some believed could have been used as a step for someone entering or exiting. Yet, for many investigators, the intruder theory could not easily reconcile with the ransom note's tone and length, the absence of foreign footprints in the snow outside the home, and the peculiar staging in the basement. The fact that the note was written inside the house, using the Ramsays' own pen and paper, meant the writer would have had to take considerable time, something a random intruder might not risk with the family at home. This led to the enduring divide. Was the crime the work of a family member or an outsider who knew the family personally? Over time, the pineapple evidence became one of the most stubborn facts in the case. If Burke had nothing to do with the events that night, How did JonBenét come to eat pineapple in the late hours before her death? If she had shared it with an intruder, that would imply a level of comfort with the person, or that she was coaxed into the kitchen after being awakened. If she had shared it with Burke, it opened the door to the theory of a domestic accident. Each possibility carried implications that pointed investigators in very different directions. The flashlight in the kitchen added to the speculation. It was a large, heavy Maglite-style flashlight, one capable of delivering the type of blunt force injury found on JonBenét's skull. The Ramseys denied ownership of the flashlight, but some friends and relatives claimed to have seen a similar one in their home before. No fingerprints were found on it, suggesting it had been wiped clean. In the accident theory, this could have been the object used to strike JonBenét during a moment of frustration or play, causing the injury that ultimately led to her death. As the case unfolded, the tension between the family accident theory and the intruder theory defined nearly every debate. The pineapple and fingerprints seemed to point inward, while the unidentified male DNA on the clothing pointed outward. Investigators and experts split sharply, and the public followed suit, often aligning with one camp or the other. The result was a case in which nearly every piece of evidence had two interpretations, one implicating the family, the other suggesting an outsider. This unresolved tension has kept the JonBenét Ramsey case one of the most analyzed, theorized, and controversial unsolved murders in modern American history. The pineapple in her stomach, the fingerprints on the bowl, the heavy flashlight, and the presence of individuals like Oliva and Helgoth remain fixed points in a puzzle that continues to defy a single, universally accepted answer. Over the years, that hope has fueled renewed calls for action from retired detectives, private investigators, and even members of the Ramsey family. But the Boulder Police Department has been reluctant to hand over the evidence for independent review, citing chain of custody concerns and the integrity of the case file. Critics argue that this hesitation has only deepened public mistrust, with many believing vital opportunities have been missed. The forensic genealogy approach, which uses consumer DNA databases and complex family tree mapping, has solved dozens of cold cases worldwide. Yet for JonBenét, the process remains stalled in bureaucratic limbo. Experts say that even degraded or mixed DNA samples could yield matches if technology were applied correctly today. The challenge lies in gaining official approval to revisit the evidence, an approval that, for nearly 3 decades, has remained elusive. Meanwhile, conflicting theories about what happened on Christmas night in 1996 have cemented the case as one of America's most divisive true crime puzzles. The ransom note, still the longest ever left in a kidnapping case, remains a central enigma. Linguistic analysts have found subtle cues suggesting personal knowledge of the Ramsey household, while others point to phrasing that feels deliberately theatrical, as though the writer wanted to mimic a Hollywood crime plot. That alone keeps both the family involvement and intruder camps equally entrenched. Then there's the basement window. John Ramsey once claimed it had been broken months before, when he locked himself out of the house. Investigators later debated whether the window was a genuine point of entry or a convenient narrative to explain an open access point. Crime scene photographs showed cobwebs still intact, which some believe would have been disturbed if an intruder had climbed through. Over the years, suspects like Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender, have surfaced with partial confessions or suspicious behaviors. Oliva allegedly told a friend he had hurt a little girl on the night JonBenét died. Yet no physical evidence has ever linked him directly to the crime scene. Michael Helgoth, another potential suspect, was found dead in what authorities ruled a suicide shortly after a public statement by the Boulder Day suggested the killer might soon be caught. Both men remain part of the case's shadowy orbit of what-ifs. As the years passed, the Ramsey family's relationship with law enforcement grew increasingly strained. Initially cooperative, they soon became defensive, especially after a grand jury in 1999 voted to indict John and Patsy on charges of child abuse resulting in death and obstruction of justice. The district attorney at the time refused to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence, effectively leaving the case in limbo. This decision has since fueled conspiracy theories about political influence and the protection of prominent families. The public's perception of the case has also been shaped by sensational media coverage. Early tabloid headlines painted the Ramseys as guilty before trial, while televised documentaries alternated between portraying them as grieving parents or cold-blooded masterminds. Burke Ramsay, who largely stayed out of the public eye for years, later gave a rare interview in 2016, during which his demeanor reignited debate over whether he had played any role in the tragedy. In recent years, independent investigators have pushed for advanced testing on items such as the garrote cord, JonBenét's clothing, and even the ransom note's paper fibers. Some believe a full reanalysis could reveal touch DNA from skin cells invisible to the naked eye. Others caution that the handling of evidence in 1996, before strict contamination protocols became standard, may have compromised the samples beyond repair. Still, the possibility of a definitive answer remains. The technology exists. The public will is there. What's missing is the institutional green light to proceed. And until that happens, the JonBenét Ramsey case remains a haunting collision of forensic science, legal politics, and human tragedy, its answers locked away in an evidence room, waiting for the day someone decides to look again. Over 500 pieces of evidence were tested in the years following the murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. Investigators collected fibers, handwriting samples, DNA swabs, paint chips, carpet fibers, hair strands, anything that could potentially point to a suspect. The sheer volume of material filled evidence lockers and archive boxes across Boulder and beyond. Yet despite the mountain of physical clues, no one has been convicted. More than 1,000 people were interviewed, neighbors, friends, former acquaintances, and strangers whose names came up through tips. Detectives followed leads from across the United States and overseas, chasing down connections that sometimes seemed promising but always collapsed under scrutiny. Over 20,000 tips flooded hotlines, letters, and police channels. Many came from well-meaning citizens who believed they saw something suspicious. Others were hoaxes, confessions from unstable individuals, or pure misinformation that burned precious time and resources. The most enduring piece of physical evidence has always been the unidentified DNA, first detected in 1996 on JonBenét's underwear, later confirmed through advanced testing in 2008 and 2016. This genetic profile, belonging to an unknown male, was critical in publicly exonerating the Ramsey family in 2008 when then Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey announced that no member of the household could have committed the crime based on the DNA evidence available at the time. But that conclusion was not as solid as it appeared. In 2016, new touch DNA analysis revealed that the profile was not from a single male. Instead, there were mixtures, multiple male contributors, a finding that shattered the lone intruder theory and raised new questions about contamination. Could the original DNA have come from manufacturing or packaging of the clothing? Could multiple contributors point to secondary transfer, perhaps from police or lab handling? Suspicion had already, for years, turned toward 9-year-old Burke Ramsey. A bowl of pineapple with his fingerprints was discovered in the kitchen on the morning of December 26. The contents of JonBenét's stomach, according to the autopsy, showed partially digested pineapple, consistent with having eaten the fruit within 2 hours of death. Investigators quietly considered whether there had been a sibling altercation that escalated, perhaps Burke striking JonBenét in anger, causing a head injury, and the parents staging the scene to protect their son. Theories suggested that the garrote, the staged ransom note, and the open basement window could have been part of an elaborate cover-up. Those who supported the intruder theory countered that the pineapple could have been eaten earlier in the day or even force-fed by an intruder. But the forensic timeline, pineapple in the stomach, fingerprints on the bowl, the Ramseys claiming they never served it that night, left an uncomfortable gap in the family's account. The ransom note itself has been one of the most dissected pieces of evidence in American criminal history. Written on paper from inside the Ramsey home, with a pen belonging to Patsy, it contains strange phrases like, "We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction," and demanded $118,000, almost exactly the amount John Ramsey had received as a bonus that year. Handwriting experts could not conclusively match it to Patsy, but many saw similarities. Others believed it was too long and bizarre for a genuine ransom, pointing instead to staged authorship. While suspicions swirled around the Ramseys, there were also outside suspects. Gary Oliva, a known sex offender living in Boulder at the time, allegedly told a friend he had hurt a little girl on the night of JonBenét's death. He was later found with a photograph of her in his backpack. Oliva has been questioned multiple times but never charged in connection with the murder. Another name that surfaced was Michael Helgoth, a local man tied to a possible property dispute and described by acquaintances as having a disturbing fascination with violence. Helgoth died of an apparent suicide shortly after the Boulder DA announced they were closing in on a suspect in the Ramsey case. Whether his death was connected remains unproven. There were also theories involving Santa Bill McReynolds, a man who had played Santa Claus at a Christmas party the Ramseys attended shortly before the murder. McReynolds' wife had written a play involving the death of a young girl, fueling speculation. But both he and his wife were eventually cleared. With so many theories, an intruder entering through the basement window, a family member staging the crime scene, or a stranger with a twisted obsession, investigators became locked in a cycle of competing narratives. Political pressure, public outrage, and media frenzy made consistent investigation difficult. The Boulder Police Department clashed repeatedly with the district attorney's office over direction and suspect focus. Over the decades, technology advanced. Forensic genealogy emerged as a powerful new tool, the same method that identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer in 2018 after decades of anonymity. This process involves uploading crime scene DNA profiles to public genealogy databases and searching for distant relatives, then building family trees backward to find potential suspects. In the Ramsey case, advocates and retired investigators have pushed for the unknown DNA from JonBenét's clothing to be retested and run through these systems. They argue that even if the profile is partial, it might be enough to match to relatives, providing a new investigative starting point. But bureaucratic hesitation, chain of custody concerns, and debates over the original sample's purity have stalled progress. Despite these obstacles, the potential is staggering. Forensic genealogy has solved cases that were cold for twice as long as JonBenét's. Even a small breakthrough, matching the DNA to a third cousin, could blow the investigation wide open. The unresolved nature of the case has taken a toll on everyone connected to it. The Ramsey family endured years of public suspicion and tabloid vilification. Detectives who worked the case in its early days still voice frustration over missed opportunities, from not fully securing the crime scene on day one, to allowing the Ramseys to remain in their home overnight, to permitting friends to clean parts of the house before evidence could be processed. In 2022, renewed calls for independent DNA testing reached a fever pitch as the 26th anniversary approached. Former law enforcement officials insisted that modern technology could extract usable data from previously inconclusive samples. The Boulder Police Department issued statements claiming the case was still active, but critics accused them of protecting past mistakes rather than aggressively pursuing justice. Over nearly 3 decades, false confessions have further muddied the waters. Perhaps the most infamous came from John Mark Carr, a schoolteacher who claimed he was with JonBenét when she died. His DNA did not match, and his story contained glaring inconsistencies, but his confession nonetheless dominated headlines for weeks before collapsing under scrutiny. The case has also endured in the court of public opinion. Television specials, documentaries, podcasts, and books have kept the murder in the cultural consciousness, ensuring new generations know the name JonBenét Ramsey. Each retelling reignites old debates. Was this a tragic accident inside the family home, or the work of a sadistic outsider? After 28 years of lies, dead ends, and shattered lives, one truth remains. The killer is still out there. Somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened on that cold December night in Boulder. Was it a stranger, slipping silently into the basement on Christmas night, evading the family, writing a bizarre ransom note, and leaving behind a trail of confusion? Or was it someone who lived under that roof? Someone who didn't need to break in? Someone whose presence was never questioned? The answer lies buried in the evidence. In fibers trapped in tape, in microscopic skin cells clinging to fabric, in the patterns of handwriting and the timeline of pineapple digestion. Waiting for the day someone looks again, with fresh eyes, sharper tools, and the determination to cut through decades of noise. Until then, the case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved murders, not because there's no evidence, but because the evidence has yet to be fully unlocked. If this investigation moved you, don't just click away. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dive true crime documentaries, where we uncover the cases that others have forgotten, the evidence others have overlooked, and the truths some would rather keep buried. Share this video with friends, family, or anyone who still believes JonBenét's case deserves answers, because awareness is the first step toward justice. Every new voice, every new set of eyes on this case, increases the chances that someone, somewhere, will come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. And now, we want to hear from you. What do you believe happened that night in Boulder? Was it a cold-blooded intruder who slipped in unnoticed, or did the truth unfold within the very walls of the Ramsay home? Drop your theory in the comments below, not just for debate, but for the record. Because one day, when the truth finally comes out, your words could reflect the theory that was right all along. Justice for JonBenét is still possible, but it will take persistence, attention, and people who refuse to let her story fade into silence.